the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi began on July 2nd, 1946, when Medgar Evers led a small group of World War II veterans to the courthouse to vote in the first election after the war. A group of armed white men chased them away from the polls, and the senator at the time, Bilbo, who we talked about in the previous chapter, he recommended that people visited blacks the night before the polls opened to discourage them from voting. And the other is that young African Americans believed college was the way to obtain the American dream. They were fiercely determined to reach this goal, and college students played a major role in the civil rights movement as a whole. So, just like in all the other chapters that we have done so far, the governor at the time really dictates what the climate is like in our state. So in 1959, Ross Barnett was the governor, and he promised to keep Mississippi segregated. He wanted black-only schools, white-only schools. He wanted it to stay the way that it was. So he enacted 2 amendments during his 3rd term in office to keep blacks from voting. The first allowed the governor to halt any school in the state that wished to integrate, and he could close all the schools if that's what he wanted. So if any school if there was a white school trying to admit black students, he could stop that. And if they didn't listen, he could just close schooling altogether, and no one got educated. And the other amendment was just kind of vague. And what it said was people of good moral character were the only ones that could vote. So the voting clerk people were able to use that amendment to turn blacks away from the polls. Because again, it's vague. Good moral character. You can spin that any way you would like and make it so that somebody couldn't vote based off of that amendment. So in that same year, he ratified the 2 amendments to the Mississippi Constitution. JFK was elected president. So we had a new president while this was happening in Mississippi. After that, James Howard Meredith enrolled at Jackson State University, and his goal was to eventually attend the University of Mississippi. Meredith was the first African-American student admitted to a white college in Mississippi, and he was the first to break the color barrier. He was not, however, the first one to try. So here we have Harry Murphy, and during World War II, he attended school at Ole Miss under the V-12 program. And what the V-12 program did was allow young officers to go to college so that they could become commissioned officers. However, his military information incorrectly recognized him as Caucasian. So due to an error in paperwork, he was marked as Caucasian and was able to attend college because of it. Then there was Charles Dubois, who was a black minister. He applied to Ole Miss Law School, and he already had 2 other degrees. He wanted a law degree now. He told the dean he didn't want any trouble or publicity from his application, and he would live off campus in a black neighborhood. He just wanted to be able to go to class and be left alone. After his application passed through many powerful hands, the dean eventually handed the application over to the college board. People at the college board recommended that Dubois be admitted, but the board of trustees rejected his application. So he was just trying to be peaceful about it. He didn't want anyone to even really know he was there. He wasn't going to live on the campus. He was just going to go and attend law classes, and they said no. Medgar Evers applied to Ole Miss a few months after Charles did. He was rejected in 1954. 2 letters of recommendation from the alumni were required with the application, and that's why he was rejected, because he did not have 2 letters of recommendation from any alumni. And the board was surprised that he had gotten letters, so they changed the requirements. Evers was employed by the NAACP. While getting the next 2 letters, the college board changed the number of required letters to 5. So during this time, he was offered the position of state field secretary for the NAACP, and he abandoned admission to Ole Miss and accepted the position. So basically, he applied to Ole Miss because he didn't have the letters of recommendation that he needed. And then when he got the letters and turned them in with his application, they changed the requirement so that they needed 5 letters of recommendation, and Medgar only had his 2, so he got denied. Then we have Mr. King. He believed the college board would find something wrong with his application and deny him on a technicality, like they kind of did with Evers. So he decided to go to Oxford to make a personal application. The governor was informed that he was going to give his application in person, And the governor realized that he would need to prevent any violence that might occur when he tried to do so. So the governor sent a highway patrolman to Oxford, and King was escorted to a room and left for several hours. He believed he was in danger, so he began shouting for help. The governor termed him mentally unstable and sent him to a hospital. He left the state after he was released. So this poor guy was basically set up and left in a room all by himself for hours, and when he thought that he might be in trouble, he started yelling for someone to help him, and they said he was mentally unstable and couldn't even go to college, which is awful. Then we have Clyde Kennard. He was discharged as a U.S. Army sergeant in 1952, and he applied to Southern Miss in 1959. After he applied, his poultry farm, which is a chicken farm, was foreclosed, and his car insurance was canceled. The local bank refused to release his bank records as well. They wouldn't tell him why that happened. A $25 bag of chicken feed was stolen from the Forest County, and a young black man admitted to stealing it and said he sold it to Kennard. Kennard was sentenced to 7 years in prison. So he was sentenced to prison because a young guy said that he stole the chicken feed and sold it to him. So he might not even have known that it was stolen. He was still 7 years in prison. He was released early from his sentence, though, when he got cancer, and he died in 1963. So in December 2005, the young African-American that said that he sold the stolen chicken feed to him said that he had been pressured into framing him. So this poor man went to prison for something he didn't even do. On March 27, 1961, a group of Jackson State University students were demonstrating because another group of black students had been jailed for trying to use the Jackson Public Library. Just for trying to use the library, that's the public library, a group of black students were sent to jail. So James Howard Meredith was enrolled at Jackson State at the time, and in May 1961, he filed a lawsuit in federal court to seek admission at the University of Mississippi. He wanted out of JSU and wanted to go to the University of Mississippi. Meredith was born in 1933, and he moved to Florida when he was 16. And after graduating high school in Florida, he returned to Mississippi and attended Jackson State University. He sought admission to Ole Miss because he believed breaking the color barrier was extremely important. When the application was denied, he filed suit claiming he had been rejected solely based on race. For months, his case was in federal court. Eventually, the campus was ordered to allow him to register as an undergraduate student. The governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, the guy who did not want schools to be segregated at the time, refused to accept the decision. Twice, he physically refused Meredith entry. He stood and blocked him from even getting on campus. He even promised the people of Mississippi that he would close the school if he needed to prevent integration. He was threatening to close a college just because Mr. Meredith wanted to attend it. So, Mississippi officials had reached the legal limits of resistance. The black community was strongly united behind him. The white community wanted resistance. Many leaders realized that if the resistance continued, widespread violence could break out. The governor was charged with contempt of court for blocking Meredith from the university. Large numbers of students and non-students were gathered when Meredith checked into his dorm on September 30th, 1962. Federal marshals guarded his dorm at night. On the night he arrived at the school, a riot broke out, and federal marshals, the National Guard, and eventually U.S. troops had to be called in to stop it. Meredith is still an active alumni at the university. Guys, all because a man wanted to go to the University of Mississippi, there were riots that the federal marshals, the National Guard, and the troops had to call in to stop. That is crazy. While Meredith was at the University of Mississippi, he organized peaceful protests. He announced he and other young blacks would use every legal method possible to produce racial and social justice in Mississippi, and he became the face of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. 3 weeks after his announcement, he was shot to death. 1963. Jackson police and the FBI officials managed to trace the gun to Beckwith, and Beckwith was arrested 10 days after the shooting. Beckwith was vain. He handed out pictures that he wanted reporters to use in the newspaper. He got caught, and he handed out his own photograph so they could put his face on the front page of the newspaper. He had a strong desire to be quoted and discussed in the media. He wanted to talk to the newspapers and tell them exactly what he was thinking, why he did it. He wanted all the attention. The Clarion Ledger newspaper was hostile to any social changes in Mississippi. One columnist for the Ledger believed blacks had murdered Evers as a martyr for the cause. So remember how we talked about newspapers can influence, and like news companies can influence people just based off of who's writing the article. It can do a lot of damage to someone's reputation. So someone in the Clarion Ledger was saying that a black man killed Evers just to make it look like it was a white man and make everyone mad. Obviously, the newspaper is very different today, and an African American served as its editor from 2002 to 2011. So things obviously changed for the better with that newspaper, but back then it tried to spin the whole assassination to make it look like it was a planned thing. While awaiting trial, the person that did the assassination, Beckwith, wrote letters detailing his racial theories. These letters were used as evidence of his racist tendencies in court. January to February 1964, his first trial was held. The jury was unable to agree on a verdict, which this guy was handing out his headshot and quotes and things. Crazy. April, long time, 1964, Beckwith's second trial also ended in a hung jury. Then Circuit Judge Mr. Henrich declared a mistrial and dismissed him on a bond. One attorney present at the trial said, "I think it never occurred to Beckwith that he would be found guilty." District Attorney Bill Waller was determined to serve justice to him. October 1989, a journalist for the Clarion Ledger reported the state may have influenced some of the jurors in the second trial. Mr. Evers' wife was called for the new trial. The Hinds County District Attorney and the Assistant District Attorney went in search of new evidence that could bring about the retrial. Beckwith had been bragging about the murder for over 20 years, and the new jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. But guys, this was from back in 1963. Evers was assassinated. He didn't go to jail until 1989-ish. So, once Barnett was gone, Paul B. Johnson was the new governor. And this was the first governor election since Reconstruction that a Republican had made significant progress in Mississippi. Remember, Republicans were considered the Black People's Party. It was discovered that the number of Republicans in Mississippi was more than people expected. Johnson declared the hate, prejudice, and ignorance would not lead Mississippi. He won high praise for his remark in his inaugural address. He led a positive and fruitful administration that allowed Mississippians used to the new race relations. In a ceremony in 1965, he announced the state's effort to balance agriculture and industry had been achieved, so that BAWI Act that we had talked about last chapter, he announced that it worked. So under Mr. Johnson, civil rights activity skyrocketed during the summer of 1964. Hundreds of college students from across the nation came to Mississippi to conduct freedom schools and voter registration drives to encourage blacks to exercise their rights as citizens. Some newspapers wrote that the hippies, which were Northern students, were only in Mississippi to make trouble. The KKK reformed and violence broke out. There were 3 murders, 88 beatings, 35 shootings, and 1,000 arrests during the summer of 1964. 35 churches were burned and 31 other buildings were bombed. The students and blacks launched a new force in politics despite this devastation. They did not give up. They did not back down. This is something, the Philadelphia murders, that was very sad. 3 students working with the COFO went to investigate the rumors that a church had been burned in Philadelphia, and they were arrested and released later that night. And while they were driving home after being arrested, they were overtaken by the KKK, who murdered them. When Mississippi refused to bring charges against the Klansmen, the federal government took over and filed charges against 18 suspects, and 17 of them were found guilty. So 3 young students were murdered investigating a church that got burnt down. And luckily, 17 of the people did get served justice and were found guilty. So in 1964, a group of civil rights leaders established the Freedom Democratic Party. The party declared that the regular Mississippi Democrats were not loyal to the National Party. It was eventually decided on national television that both factions would represent Mississippi at a national convention. The regulars rejected this and left the convention. They were eventually forced to accept blacks into the party. And when Bill Waller was elected governor in 1971, the two parties merged indefinitely. So we cannot make compromises. We were struggling until 1971. Bill Waller had the parties merge. Fannie Lou Hamer. She was famous because of the National Democratic Party convention in 1964, actually. She testified to the Credentials Committee that she was a good choice for Congress by telling them about her life and her family. She ran for U.S. Congress in 1964 on the Freedom Democratic Party ticket, but lost. She won the fondness of thousands of Americans, though, who had fought for racial equality. She spoke at many rallies and was best known for saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She was one of the most loved civil rights activists in America in 1977. So during the civil rights movement, Congress passed several laws in 1964 and 1965 that were major racial reforms. These laws made discrimination illegal in voting, hiring, housing, and in public places. Governor Johnson told Mississippians that the law would be enforced whether they liked it or not. So after the Pennsylvania the murders and the churches being burned and all this, they had to make new laws that said you could not discriminate based off of race. In January 1966, though, a group of KKK members firebombed the home of Vernon Dahmer. His children and wife escaped, but he was shot multiple times and died the next day. Businesses and individuals helped his wife rebuild their home. Several KKK members were caught and convicted, but Sam Bowers, who was tried 4 times, had 4 mistrials. Sounds familiar, those mistrials that happened with Evers. Jerry Mitchell of the Clarion Ledger was at it again, and in 1998, new evidence that he discovered helped to find Bowers guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and died in 2006. So, the election of 1967, Congressman John Bell Williams was stripped of his seniority by the Democratic Party because he supported a Republican in the 1964 presidential campaign. The congressman resigned and came to Mississippi, where he was elected governor. Robert Clark. In 1967, 22 blacks were elected to public office. Robert Clark became the first black man in the state legislature since 1894. That's a long time. He was a teacher with 2 degrees and was a major player in the Education Reform Acts of 1982. He received many honors for his dedication to education. Then we have the governor. Governor Williams was known for his encouragement of states' rights and segregation. Under his administration, the largest integration in Mississippi's history took place. Public schools were consolidated by 1970. All the schools were mixed. Many whites enrolled in private schools during this time to escape going to school with any black students. Although Williams was not happy about the federally mandated integration, he did not get in the way of it. He let it happen. He stood back. He didn't necessarily want the schools to combine, but he let it happen. And most whites also accepted that of the school system. They had fought it long enough. They knew the right thing to do was to let the schools desegregate.